Thank you, Lisa, and a very good evening to everybody this evening. I'm an Englishman, but I am a great admirer of Scotland and all things Scottish. My mother-in-law is Scottish, and I've spent quite a bit of time up in Scotland throughout my life, and I find it a wonderful place. And so I'm going to share with you tonight really a 50-year period that is very, very important, both for Scottish art, but also a period of transformation towards modern art. Tonight we're really looking at the other side of a lot of the paintings that I've been talking about in over this past year, the Victorian art. But we often forget that up in Edinburgh and in Glasgow, there was a very vibrant art scene. And in fact, Scots artists have a very important part to play in the 19th century, particularly the latter part of the 19th century. So we're going to do a little tour, a miscellany as well. I can't possibly go into great detail about all the artists covered tonight, but I hope it'll give you a picture of some of the exciting artists that make up the art of Scotland. And the period that we're really engaged with tonight will be the last years of Victoria's reign. And we're going up to 1930, basically because it includes a very important group of artists who were born in the 19th century, but who come to sort of flowering in after the First World War and through to 1930, and they are the Scottish colorists. And I'll be giving you a few tips about books if you're interested in Scottish art at the end, and there'll be a PDF available for you to download from our site, just to give you a little bit of background on Scots art, should you wish to follow that up. But we're going to take a little bit of a trip back in time, and we come back to the 18th century, the great period of the Enlightenment, in a golden age really of Scottish painting, where some of the really great painters of Scotland come to prominence, particularly the art of Henry Raeburn. There's a wonderful portrait there of Sir Walter Scott, and we know that Sir Walter Scott plays a very important part in the identity, or certainly our understanding of modern Scotland. Alan Ramsay, particularly, who was associated with many of the philosophers of Scotland in the Enlightenment period, and very much part of that group, that elite within Edinburgh. David Allen, whose paintings, the origin of painting there is one of a very important work, and Alexander Naismith and his landscapes, and that gives you an example of a great Scots artist of the 18th century. So a lot of the photographs that I'm going to show you this evening are taken in galleries in Scotland. I was fortunate just about 2 years ago to go up to Edinburgh and Dundee, and I photographed a lot of the paintings there, particularly, and what really attracted me were the works of some of the Glasgow boys as well, and seeing some of their really exciting work, often relegated in a way in a lot of galleries to the back room or to the picture store. It's so unfortunate because there's so much Scottish art that really should be better known. And the Scottish 19th century continued on a good trajectory. There are some famous artists of the 19th century, of the age of the early Victorian period, particularly Sir David Wilkie, a friend of J.M.W. Turner, and he was a very fine artist, and his paintings particularly are very strong paintings, but he spent a lot of his career back in England, and exhibited in England, as did so many Scots artists. And during the Victorian period too, we have fine artists like John Petty, who picked a number of very important subjects and historical subjects that, but similar to many of the artists of the Royal Academy in England, and his work has a strong structure and is strongly painted, but it wasn't distinct really from a lot of other Victorian art. Perhaps one of the most interesting artists of the earlier part of this talk would be Sir William Quiller Orchardson, who mainly exhibited at the Royal Academy. And his paintings are often, such as this one up here, The Toilers of the Sea, 1870. They're finely painted pictures, and sometimes his later work also depicts awkward social situations as well. But these artists there wasn't a distinct voice really for Scots art until the arrival of some of the artists that we consider this evening. And of course, the English view of Scotland during the earlier part of Victoria's reign was certainly one very much shaped by the novels of Sir Walter Scott and a romantic view of the Highlands and Scotland itself. Three examples here of a typical engagement with Scotland would be J.M.W. Turner, who spent quite a bit of time in Scotland, painting in Scotland right from his early years. One of his early trips at the beginning of the 19th century was to Scotland, and he continued to paint Scottish views, and one of the Falls of the Clyde is one of his later colour beginnings. Of course, the most famous painting, perhaps, that's in the National Gallery of Scotland now, which has just been acquired for the National Gallery of Scotland in the last few years, is Sir Edwin Landseer's The Monarch of the Glen, painted in 1851, which I'm sure all of you will know that particular painting. A very fine painting it is, but it is a romantic view of Scotland, and probably an English upper class view of Scotland, rather than something that's distinguishedly homegrown. And then, of course, we have, in the later part of the 19th century, we have John Everett Millais painting in Scotland. He spends quite a bit of his life in Scotland in the autumn season, shooting and hunting, but he also paints, and he paints this rather romantic view, an idyll of 1745, which really does not sum up the bloody history of Scotland or of Culloden Field or of the Jacobite uprising. It's a romantic view of what might have happened with the little English drummer with the Scottish lasses entranced by the fifers playing. So it is not something homegrown, and whilst it is a fine Victorian painting, it isn't necessarily something that really connects with the underlying spirit of Scotland. There's a very interesting thing on at the moment on the radio, presented by Kirsty Walk, which looks at the relationship of Scotland with its writers, and this will parallel some of the paintings I'm going to show you tonight. So I would suggest that you do seek that out if you can get hold of that. You'll find it quite interesting. And indeed, there are mentions within Kirsty Walk's talk programs which mention some of the artists that I'm talking about tonight. So this is a well-known Scots artist, Thomas Fayed, and this is his well-known painting, The Last of the Clan. And this one, again, but is a Scot, this one has something of a romantic view. It's also partly viewed by the younger artists as something of a compromise. It was shown at the Royal Academy and the Royal Scots Academy, but again it shows the defeated clansman, the end of the line, and the Scots as a bowed down, almost broken people by the Highland clearances. And of course, the clearances are part of a very painful hit back story to tonight, and to Scots wanting their own identity within their own art. Fayed paints very well. These genre subjects are painted meticulously, rather like William Powell Frith down in England. But they have sometimes a cloying sentimentality about it, which can to our modern eyes appear quite awkward. But there we are. That is The Last of the Clan, a very famous painting, by the way, and one that's often cited. Particularly, many Victorian homes actually had this as a mezzotint engraving on their wall. But again, possibly echoing this idea of a rather sanitized view of Scotland, and not something that was really really engaging with what it was like to live in Scotland during the latter part of the 19th century. And so come a group of artists that we're going to look at tonight, collectively known as the Glasgow Boys, although they included women as well, I would say. And there are a number of very notable artists among this group. And they are a group of painters, not necessarily united by manifesto, but they are all united by the idea of doing something new in Scotland and about Scotland. Some of them have to travel abroad. Some of them, of course, have to exhibit in London because they can't get exhibitions in Scotland. The Royal Scottish Academy is incredibly difficult to get a painting into, and some of them also because they are adopting new styles of painting, particularly influenced by French Impressionism, that they're not always readily accepted by more traditional picture buying public. But these are some examples of the artists. So we can see here some of the type of work that we'll be looking at tonight. And the great themes of Scots art, which are really consistent throughout the latter part of the Victorian era and right through into the 1930s, are of course the magnificent landscape of Scotland, particularly water, sea and sky. This is a great feature, and something that many a Scots artist is very, very proud of, and rightly so, and often seeking some of the really dramatic locations around the islands and the coastline of Scotland. Portraits and still life, always a staple of all artists, really, particularly as we enter the 20th century. The still life and portrait become even more important as artists tend to look towards Europe rather than consider what's going on in London as of great importance. And we're going to be looking at the scenes from everyday life, which actually, of course, parallels a lot that's going on in Scots literature at this time too. And then there's leisure and sport, and by that we're looking at things like games of tennis, particularly the painting by Levery, which is particularly important, but also looking at field sports as well, and those are very frequently painted by Scots artists. And then we shouldn't forget that there is an enormous Scottish diaspora. Many Scots artists work abroad, and particularly go to warmer climes, particularly North Africa and to the south coast of France, but retaining their Scots identity. And then as we enter the period, we're looking at agriculture and the working poor and social realist art, which really takes off in Scotland in a very, very big way. So it's a very interesting number of different subjects that these artists are engaged with. But you will notice among that list, really, from the themes of this 50-year period, that there isn't history painting, religious painting, or allegorical painting, all of which are important to the academies, but to the new emerging Scottish artists, this is are not considered as important. It has to be engaged with reality to some extent. And it is the 50 years that changed the art world, both generally and in Europe. And we think of the great Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his great influence upon Scottish art and design, and his the Glasgow School of Art. And then as we pass through the First World War, we'll see how that too affected Scottish artists, and how there was a return to realism. And the Scots artists are very well aware of the things going on in modernism, and Roger Fry's exhibition of 1910 at the Grafton Galleries, exposing people for the first time really to modern and post-impressionist art in London. And Scots artists, through certain dealers that we're going to be looking at, became aware of the art of France, which exerts a particular influence upon Scots artists particularly. There's always been this closeness between France and Scotland. The Glasgow international exhibitions are of incredible importance, and particularly the one held in 1888, attended by Her Majesty Queen Victoria at Kelvin Grove, is seen as a very, very important exhibition. and one of many that took place throughout Europe during this period. And certainly the one at Kelvin Grove in Glasgow is very, very important. And of course, that now houses the great art gallery in the city of Glasgow. And then other artists training down in London as under Henry Tonks at the Slade School. And some of our artists that we're looking at tonight did that. And then, of course, some Scots artists go off and actually are called and fight in the First World War. And all the time this is going on, there is still the traditional and academic painting that some artists, particularly like Joseph Farquharson, are continuing to paint in a more conventional style. And then as we leave the period under consideration, we see the artists going down and joining artist colonies on the south of France at Collioure. So it's a very dynamic period of change. There's always been this great tension between Glasgow and Edinburgh. For those of you who may know less about this, Glasgow is always seen as the great industrial city of Scotland, and Edinburgh the great seat of government and of the Enlightenment and of intellect and of the great literary traditions. And yet Glasgow certainly as the 19th century progressed, started to punch well above its weight and came up with, this is the great Kelvin Grove Art Gallery Museum, which is part of the great exhibition in 1888. And then, of course, the wonderful building of the Glasgow School of Art, which unfortunately has suffered 2 catastrophic fires in recent years, but we can't underestimate Glasgow School of Art's importance. The Royal Scottish Academy, which is just above the National Gallery of Scotland, was referred to by many Scots artists as the Edinburgh Academy, because it was very, very difficult for younger Scottish artists to actually get their pictures exhibited in an open exhibition or to become Royal Scottish Academicians. And it became really a sort of thorn in the side of many a young artist. So many of them joined together, and some of them were amateurs, but they joined together at the Glasgow Art Club. And it was set up by an amateur artist in 1867, but it had became a very, very important institution. And particularly, it was the first place that some of the artists we're looking at this evening were actually able to show together, meet together and discuss art together. And it became important for the Glasgow boys, as it was also for the latter colorists as well. And that's their main exhibition room at the Glasgow Art Club. And it's still an active place today, a gallery today, but it was very, very important in the 1880s. And some of the artists we're considering tonight met there and really discussed their ideas together there, rather like the French Impressionists at the Salon des Refuses. It had that appeal to it, and certainly for the more rebellious of the younger artists, that was where they went. And they were attracted by ideas coming from France, particularly the idea of plein air painting. That is going directly to the subject, not painting in the studio, but taking your canvases out into the fields and beaches and headlands of Scotland and painting directly from landscape. In the top left-hand corner, we can see the artist William MacTaggart on a Scottish beach, actually painting one of his enormous seascapes. I think if you notice on that photograph, there's obviously somebody sort of holding his canvas behind, because if anybody has actually been to Scotland in certain types of weather, you'll know you have to be a peculiarly hardy individual to continue to paint outdoors there all the year round. But certainly an artist like James Guthrie made a great thing of actually painting out in nature. And he came from a humble background, a son of a preacher, I believe, but he took up art and he worked very, very hard at it. And that is the subject, that is the title, in fact, of his 1883 painting. So it's the period too where other artists, of course, in France, like Vincent van Gogh, were also working out of doors, and of course the French Impressionists. So it was very much something that seized a lot the imaginations of a lot of the younger Scottish artists. And they were particularly in thrall to the great French artist, Jules Bastien Lafarge. Now, Lafarge's work followed in the tradition of Jean-Francois Millet, painting rural labour and labourers, often doing menial tasks on the farm, but also showing the dignity of labour. And this appealed very greatly to many a Scots artist. They also, you can see this influence in an English artist, George Clawson, Girl at the Gate. So similar, Lafarge's influence was enormous, and he certainly influenced so many Scots artists during this period. And what the Scots artists liked about it was that there was a kind of mixture between French Impressionism, something of photography also comes into it, the idea of these enormous depths of field that you get within these sort of works, and also the very fine brushwork that you get on these paintings, that they don't actually paint like pre-Raphaelites with tiny brushes, but they're very every stroke matters on some of these realist paintings, and certainly artists like Guthrie adopts this sort of rather blocky style to his brushwork, and it's very distinctive. One of the older artists who was very important in Glasgow Art Club was William York McGregor. And this painting here, which is a fine still life, but is full size, it's 5 feet across, so it's a large still life, very not just. Initially, it included a figure on the right, a girl with the turnips, but it was seen as an important painting, and it had an effect upon a lot of artists who were turning to things like still life, and in the French tradition of Chardin. And it wouldn't be usual at the Royal Academy in London that you would see a painting of a still life painted on this scale. So it looked to a sort of continental tradition, and certainly McGregor, who had studied at Slade, was very welcoming to some of the younger artists and encouraged them greatly. And the artists were excited to spend times at the art club with McGregor and the life classes that McGregor organised within Glasgow. And one of the greatest artists to emerge really from what we know as the Glasgow Boys is the artist James Guthrie. And he was a particularly fine artist because he also, as I say, he came from humble beginnings, but he really develops and he becomes one of Scotland's greatest artists. This one, The Highland Funeral, is interesting, painted in 1882. It sort of echoes Gustave Courbet's Burial en Nom from 1850. But it is a distinctly Highland funeral. Notice there are no women there. Of course, it is a Protestant funeral, so there are no Catholic priests there or anything like that. And the simple the coffin is placed upon 2 chairs outside the little bothy. And interestingly enough, this funeral had taken place at Brig o' Turk. And Brig o' Turk was where Guthrie and a group of the Scots artists were painting that summer. And there had been a drowning in Glenfinglas. Now, those of you may have heard of Glenfinglas before, but because that is in fact where 30 years before the famous Ruskin portrait was painted. And indeed, those cottages there, one of those cottages there, the old schoolhouse, was where Ruskin and the Millets stayed on that summer in 1853. So this painting, Highland Funeral, seen as very important, and it got a lot of notice and a lot of praise, and it was seen as something distinctively new in art. Really, it had quite dour colours, but it also had a really strong sentiment to it. And his next great painting was A Hind's Daughter. And a hind is an old Scots word for a skilled farm servant, and this is very typical of a lot of the Glasgow Boys' first phase paintings. The first phase tended to be social realist paintings, and they often involve cutting of turnips or cabbages, and they show young field workers with a great deal of dignity and also compassion. Again, echoing Bastien Lafarge's work, particularly Pour Fauvette, which was an incredibly influential painting in this period. But you can see already Guthrie is developing a style that is quite distinctly his own. And you can see this blocky brush strokes. It's almost like everything is woven into the surface. It's almost like a tapestry. And the actual size of these paintings are about 4 or 5 feet high, so they're quite considerable size paintings. They're not the smaller genre type paintings that one gets in the Victorian era, and the surfaces are quite rough too. And they were very much influenced at the same time by the art of James McNeill Whistler, the great rebel and the one who I've spoken on before. And certainly James Guthrie knew the art dealer Alex Reid, who had stayed with Vincent van Gogh in Paris, and was also the interlocutor with James Abbott McNeill Whistler to Scotland as well. And so you'll probably notice that in a lot of Scots art of this period, that Whistler, who was distantly Scots, you know, in way back, he rather influenced so many of the younger Scottish artists. And you can see that in this portrait of Helen Sowerby, the Whistlerian influence in the background. And also, interestingly enough, in this portrait, we can see the Japanese influence, which was again an enormous influence upon Scots art of the latter part of the 19th century. This painting here is known by so many. It's probably one of the most famous late 19th century paintings, James Guthrie's painting To Pastures New, sometimes known as the Goose Girl, but that's in fact the wrong title. It's a very, very bold piece of painting. Again, it illustrates the rural poor. You might be surprised to know that it wasn't actually painted in Scotland, but is in fact painted in the Lincolnshire Wolds. And if you look at a very flat landscape, and in the background underneath the girl's stick driving the geese, you might even notice the spire of a Lincolnshire Wolds church in the background. But as you can see, it's a very distinctive style of painting, full of light, influenced by Impressionism, but by no means mimicking French Impressionism. It certainly has its own distinct flavour. Another artist who is associated with the Glasgow Boys is Joseph Crawhall, and again also very much influenced by Japanese art and the art of James Abbott McNeill Whistler. And so you can see by his thin application of paint that this is something quite daring, quite new. In fact, Crawhall would actually paint almost in watercolour on a kind of canvas surface. But he greatly admired Oriental art, and Oriental art does have a great influence upon so many of the Scots artists of this period. And certainly at the Great Exhibition of 1888 in Kelvin Grove, there were many, many examples of Oriental art, and some of these are now at the Burrell collection in just north of Glasgow. So we move on. Sorry, we just move on. This is going to give you another examples of Crawhall's art. Sometimes quite innovative, really, like that mare and foal. You can see the Oriental influence in that one, particularly like Oriental brush painting. And there we are. There's a painting, Landscape with Cattle, 1885. A new take on a very traditional Scots subject. There are many. If you go to the National Gallery of Scotland and you look at paintings around the 1860s, 1870s, you'll notice that there are so many paintings of Highland cattle, but they're not painted like this. This is certainly an artist who is very aware of French Impressionism, of James Abbott McNeill Whistler, and of all the moves in modern art at the time. And a fine piece of painting it is too. It's very similar actually to the great Pierre Mondrian's paintings of this period and his early period before he became an abstract painter. And here we are. This is the Japanese influence and the Whistlerian influence on an artist who is seen as very important, George Henry. Now, George Henry really exemplifies the second phase of the Glasgow boy artists, and this is known as the decorative phase. So that is where the surfaces are all important. They're almost built up like tapestries, and it's almost like a proto-Gustav Klimt in a way, that they have a lot of gold on them, and lovely decorative areas, abstract areas of patterning and colour. And these are good examples. Of course, that goes on in Whistler's work, but George Henry certainly develops this and makes it all his own. And he was so keen on the art of Japan that he actually travelled to Japan, and he comes back with a lot of these really fine pieces of work. This is, of course, a similar period that in Paris, Vincent van Gogh is being very much influenced by Japanese woodblock prints, but this is the Scottish take upon it, and we can't underestimate the influence of Japanese woodblock prints and all things Japanese upon the art of this period. You can see Mount Fuji in the top left-hand corner of the young woman in the kimono. And then George Henry also paints works like this, which are very active kind of pieces of brushwork. Then he works vigorously on the surfaces. He also paints in watercolor as well, and he's probably best known for some of these more decorative works, and some of them vaguely sentimental in a way, but they are more studio creations than Guthrie's work in many ways. They're quite obviously the result of much deliberation and preparatory sketches and things to come up with what he came up with in them. An artist who was born in Ireland, but he really makes his name in Scotland, is John Lavery, later to be known Sir John Lavery, a very, very important painter of the later Victorian era, and of course Scotland. At first, many people think, well, because there's so many paintings of his in the National Gallery of Scotland and up in Scotland, you think he must be Scots, but he actually was born in Belfast. But he did study in Glasgow, and he also studied in Paris, and both these things play an enormous influence upon his life. But he made something of a break with some of the other Glasgow boys, in that he realised that to sell a painting, and he really had to make some money, and he realised that painting young farm hands in the fields of cabbages was not really going to make him as much money as painting some of the emerging middle class of Glasgow. So this one, The Tennis Party, painted in 1885, is really a very well-known work, and it was actually a very successful one too, because it actually showed middle-class Glaswegians at play. And it's a fine painting full of activity, and he went on to paint a number of these. Lavery got criticised by a number of the Glasgow boys for actually sort of selling out to sort of middle class aspirations. So his paintings can appear, just celebrations of late Victorian and early Edwardian life in a way, but not for him were the rural poor in a way. But his paintings are full of power, and certainly his paintings are some of the first ones where we get a really great idea of late 19th century people at play and amusing themselves, and this is one painting that I really think is a really great painting. He continued to paint very successfully, and he was actually ennobled later. He painted this huge painting, The State Visit of Her Majesty Queen Victoria to the Glasgow International Exhibition 1888. He painted this. He was granted 3/4 of an hour sittings with most of the notable subjects in the foreground of this particular enormous painting, which is in Kelvin Grove. And the rest he composed from photographs and from the actual scene itself, and you can just make out Queen Victoria in the background. But as you can see, he rather annoyed some people, because he then charged people to come and look at this painting, and he made money out of it. So Lavery was always on the make in a way with making money. But he was a very fine painter. The painting of Miss Mary Burrell, daughter of the great shipping magnate from Glasgow, is a great example, something of a sort of mixture of a John Singer Sargent and a Whistler. Very fine painting, that. And Lavery went on to have a very highly successful career. And this man here, Sir William Burrell, and his collection was really is a great place. If you're ever in Scotland, the Burrell collection has a great collection of late 19th century painting, particularly those of Whistler. Has this very fine portrait of Alexander Reid, who was this great picture dealer, and introduced a lot of the Glasgow boys to French art and the bohemian world of French Impressionism. And there's the fine portrait of Alexander Reid is actually at the Burrell collection. And so the Burrell collection includes a lot of the art that we looked at this evening as well, and includes some of the Oriental artifacts as well, which became so important to so many Scots artists. Hornell, an interesting artist. I include that on the opening slide. He's interesting too because he actually at times would actually paint with Henry as well, and they would both work on the same painting. One would work on the landscape, one would work on the figures. He would even insert things like gold leaf onto his paintings, similar to Gustav Klimt in a way, of the Vienna succession. So a great artist was Hornell, and he's a very distinctive artist, but again, not possibly as well known as he should be. There we are. This is another one showing the Japanese influence. Recently, at the unfortunately, it was shown during lockdown, but at Edinburgh City Arts Centre, they showed a great exhibition of the photographic collection that Hornell had from his time in Japan. And obviously, he sketched as well when he was in Japan, but he also took there were vast numbers of photographs and Japanese prints, which all play a huge part in this in Hornell's art. Patterson, James Patterson, was an artist very much influenced by Gustave Courbet's realism and a realist approach to landscape. And there we are. But he painted throughout Europe as well as in Scotland, but always coming back home and exhibiting the work. Very nice earthy colours. There's the one from 1885 gives an example of his earlier type of work with the figure disappearing down the road. It's a fine piece of painting, full of light. It's rather like a Corot painting in some ways, but the later works were much bolder, like this one of Santa Cruz, Tenerife, painted just after the turn of the 20th century. And you can see, again, very, very bold bits of brushwork there, influenced by Gustave Courbet, the great French realist painter. Arthur Melville, who's possibly better known today for his watercolors than he is for his oil colors, although he loved painting these cabbage patches and cabbage gardens. That's his one of the cabbage garden, Arthur Melville. He also traveled considerably, and he traveled to Morocco, and he painted these very, very fine watercolors, which are sort of known as blottesque watercolors, in that it's almost like they're painting on blotting paper, and he blots out the color he applies. And so they have this very distinctive style, and he only adds Chinese white. But some of these ones, you get a great sense of light in them, and this one of Tangier is a particularly good example of some of his work, and that's Tangier 1890. Again, somewhere that was very, very popular with many, many French artists, of course, being North Africa, but also among Scots artists as well. Harrington Mann is a very fine portraitist, one who you may not have heard about, but very much in the John Singer Sargent tradition, and a fine painter too. You can see that a lot of these Scots artists are not afraid to use paint very, very, very boldly and apply the the paint with great vigor, and so as such the surfaces are very lively, and we can enjoy them for the very sort of luscious color, and also the sentiment too. You always feel there's a great sense of character in Harrington Mann's paintings. William McTaggart is an artist who spans the whole era. He shouldn't be confused with the painter of the 20th century, Sir William McTaggart, who was his grandson. But William McTaggart, this painting Spring from 1864, does show the pre-Raphaelite influence to some extent, also the influence of John Constable as well, because it has a slightly freer brush marks than a pre-Raphaelite painting, but he certainly has that sort of sentiment about his work. But the interesting thing about William McTaggart was that he went on really to become one of the boldest artists that Scotland had produced in the 19th century, producing a work like this. This is The Storm, that's painted 20 years after the other one, and he paints really an amazing sort of impressionistic things. And he painted out on the beach. Remember the photograph I showed you at the beginning of this talk, and he would paint a plein air, and the surfaces are really quite vigorous and abstract, and remind me somewhat of painters like Joe Airdley from our own times as well, and so that they're powerful pieces of painting. More examples of McTaggart. McTaggart's grave is in the Newington necropolis, and yeah, that's his grave there. I've taken a photograph of it there for you, and there we are. There's him again working on the beach on one of his large seascapes. Very much an artist who was unafraid to work boldly and large out of doors, and so perhaps some of his finest works are these late seascapes that are so moving, and they really do have something about the Scottish coast about them that really you couldn't get from photographs. You know, is somebody who really understands the sea and its many moods. There's another lovely Melville watercolor for you, and I put that on the left, and then on the right, we should not forget that Charles Rennie Mackintosh, in the latter part of his career, he was dying from cancer. He went down to the south of France and painted these wonderful watercolors down at Collier, and that's just one of them. Rennie Mackintosh's work is always full of great structure and design, and very particular about it. Of course, best expressed in his design for the Glasgow School of Art and his furniture designs and his window designs. But he was a very fine watercolorist too, and please do seek out his work if you're interested in it. Watercolours did become quite important to a number of the Scottish artists. Some of the Glasgow boys really excelled in watercolour, and even McTaggart paints some fine watercolours. These are just a few examples from this nice book on Scottish watercolours by Julian Halsby, and I'd recommend that too. It gives a good background on Scottish watercolour painting, which you don't often hear too much about, really. And Pringle's work, he also joins really this second phase of the Glasgow boys, this decorative phase, and again something very different to what's going on down in London. This is a distinctly Scots sort of painting, and this is one of his works that where he's working alongside Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and you can see something of Mackintosh's structure within Pringle's work. Fine artist. This artist here, James McLachlan Nairn, eventually emigrated to New Zealand, and if Trace is with us tonight, this painting on the right here was in fact based on Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and it's 1893 Tess, and there we are. There's the but it's actually painted in New Zealand, but he was very much influenced by the Scottish Glasgow boys, and he paints still, one almost thinks he's still thinking of Scotland even when he's in New Zealand, but it is the southern light that is upon his work, and he's considered one of the late 19th century Scottish artists who's of great renown. And then there was another strand of the decorative strand, which could also be linked with pre-Raphaelite painting too. And this is Gould's paintings, David Gould. And his paintings do almost, I mean, they lent themselves to stained glass design, possibly influenced by the Breton artists under Maurice Denis and Paul Gauguin. And they're fine work. So there is sort of amalgam of pre-Raphaelitism, of modern decorative design, and also something distinctly Scots. So these are examples of Gould's work, which can be seen in the National Gallery of Scotland. And again, a very distinct sort of style here. And it's a type of work which was very, very popular in the 1880s, 1890s. Take you on one slide. Sorry, we're just going to show you. Yes, and the influence of Art Nouveau can't be underestimated, particularly Margaret MacDonald, Rennie Mackintosh's wife, was also a fine artist, and that's her one, The Heart of the Rose, influenced by people like Aubrey Beardsley and Art Nouveau, very fine pieces of work, often rather like Henry's work and Melville's work. You know, you'd have little bits of gold attached to the surface. But there was a strand of these pre-Raphaelite influenced artists in Scotland too, and Sir Joseph Noel Paton of the 1850s and 1860s was considered a pre-Raphaelite artist, and many of his works certainly have that feel to them, and that's another one. But of course, the subject matter was very much of the earlier school, not this later school of pre-Raphaelitism, almost this turn of the century and the femme fatale image that is so apparent in works of Aubrey Beardsley, and here we have it also in Margaret MacDonald's work. And so we come into the 20th century, but all these artists were born in the 19th century and sort of cut their teeth on these artists that I've just shown you. And this other school coming out of the Glasgow boys is really also for painters who you really should know if you're into art and seeing how Scottish art developed in the early years of the 20th century. These are artists you should really know. Samuel John Peploe, John Duncan Ferguson, George Leslie Hunter, and Francis Cadell. All of these are very, very important Scots artists. And whilst their works aren't so well known all around the world, I think that their work does stand up to European sort of directly could be allied to artists of the same period, really. So there's a Francis Cadell. He was very much influenced by the work of Henri Matisse, and that's one known as the Red Chair. During the period following the First World War, there was something of a return back to a more realistic or neoclassical styles, and Francis Cadell doesn't go quite as he certainly doesn't abstract images as much as Henri Matisse does, but he does return to a sort of structure, which was something that we notice in much of the art of the 1920s, where there was, particularly in Germany, there was a return to a sort of order and a turn to realism and classicism. Cadell paints some very fine modern portraits. That's one of his portrait of a lady in black, and he paints out at Iona, and they're fine paintings. And these ones, certainly now, they'll cost you a pretty penny, some of these Cadell paintings, but you could have picked them up in the 1950s and 60s for a few £100. Now they are many, many thousands of pounds. And again, Cadell was actually influenced a lot by Manet and William Orpen in his bold use of black, which is a sort of no-no for the French Impressionists. But again, by the 20th century, bringing back up black as a colour that one could use in a painting was seen as quite okay. A lot of quite hard edges to some of Cadell's work. And he also, of course, paints in France, and he is quite the traveller as well. That's another example of his work there. And he's quite versatile, is Cadell. So the one of the castle in the middle is obviously, you've got his distinct Scots character there. But the summer garden could easily be, sort of a garden that Monet might have painted in. But he also loves painting at Iona, on the island of Iona. He sees that as a very important place to him. And he actually returns to Edinburgh eventually, and that's his house in 30 Regent Terrace in Edinburgh. That's just outside the front of his home and his studio. And John Duncan Ferguson, very much influenced by James McNeill Whistler. You can see in both these paintings a Whistler influence, both of the fireworks. This is, nearly 30 years after Whistler's painting, of which brought him the Ruskin trial. Now, Ferguson also paints fireworks and figures upon a shoreline. The portrait there, the red shawl, deliberately mimics the composition of a Whistler painting, Whistler's painting of his wife, Beatrice Whistler. And then Hunter's work, again, very much influenced by Vincent van Gogh, the richly coloured and very high impastoed surfaces, but distinctly Scottish art. And these artists have a real sense of place. And of course immensely popular. These paintings sell well to Scots expatriates throughout the world. They look for the Scottish colorists, and the Scottish colorists certainly have influenced a number of artists throughout the world. Particularly in Canada, they were a great influence upon the group of 7 who are working at the same time in Canada, up in Ontario. More examples of Hunter. Hunter, it did actually spend some of his life until 1906 in San Francisco, but following the terrible earthquake of 1906, he returned after all his early paintings were destroyed in the San Francisco earthquake. He returns to Scotland and he paints. These are some examples of his paintings. Particularly, he liked to paint on these little millboard sketches, and like so many paintings of the 1920s, you didn't, like Augustus John's paintings down in England. You didn't necessarily finish off a painting in a way. You left all the sort of workings visible on the surface, and that was very much a part of what the veracity of the artists during this period. They didn't like things to be photographic or very, very hard edge, and as such they have a great deal of life to them. And Peploe is the other artist we're going to consider. He is an artist who very much look to the Glasgow boys, but he is of this Scottish colorist tradition. Again, very, very boldly painted work. There's always a strong sense of structure in Peploe's work. And he's obviously aware of artists like Paul Cézanne and the great influence that Cézanne had upon modern art. But he doesn't go fully abstract like so many artists did. He sticks with subjects that are still recognizable and traditional. And he paints the tulips, and there we are. And he also, like so many Scots artists, he revels in painting stormy seas and skies on his native coastline. And we can detect a lot of the colorists, the Glasgow boys, in the work of Joan Airdley, an artist who died way too young, and that's her work on the left. And a lot of these works can be seen in the Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh of the Scottish colorists, and they exert a great influence upon Scottish art today. So I hope this evening I've given you a little taste of some of the artists who might be worth looking at, investigating. I've got a whole list of artists here, all of whom I think are worth looking at, and they'll be on the PDF should you wish to follow any of those up. I think you'll be rewarded by looking at all those names. As you can see, it's a big list, but many of those names are not household names to, I must confess. It takes a little bit of research to look them out. But I think you'll be well rewarded if you do seek out Scots art. It's certainly worth looking at. And these are some of the books I might recommend to you that are certainly worth looking at. particularly if you just want to dip into it, I would certainly suggest Scottish Art by Murdo MacDonald, the Thames and Hudson World of Art series. That'll give you a very good background in Scottish art and its antecedents. Very, very good. And Scottish Art in the 20th Century by Duncan Macmillan is a good one. And if you're particularly interested in the Glasgow boys, Roger Bilcliffe's book is one I certainly recommend to you, as I also recommend the recent series, which is probably on YouTube now, Lachlan Gowdy's The Story of Scottish Art, which will give you a good overview of the art of Scotland and should provide you with plenty of food for thought and a feast for your eyes. So I'm going to stop my share now and happy to answer any questions if I can answer them.